right now.
All right.
Hey,
What's
Dr.
that? Hey,
Gillborn.
what's happening today? What's good?
Hi, you all right? Can you hear me?
Yup.
Yes.
Good. I feel like some kind of Big Brother thing on the screen here. It's
Hello.
Oh man.
Hi, everyone. We're going to start off with the session titled The State of CRSEA Today and Where It's Going. We have Dr. Ann Aviles, Dr. David Stovall, and Dr. David Gillborn presenting here. I'm going to start off with some questions and then open it up to the people out here, and then also taking some questions from people on the YouTube. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on how CRT is talked about in the current context?
Well, one thing that we can, thanks again, y'all. And for the remainder of the conference, I want to dedicate all of my comments to Charles Mills and a person named Timuel Black. And Timuel Black was our lifeblood in Chicago, a historian who actually was my uncle's high school teachers, and he actually outlived my uncles. He transitioned at 102 years old. And Charles Mills, for many of us who know, great partner, colleague, friend, fellow traveler in critical race theory, and wrote a very important book called The Racial Contract that really allowed a lot of us to conceptualize and understand critical race theory in a particular way. To the current state, and Oscar, I thank you so much for that question, because I think in this current moment, when we look at the advent of Christopher Rufo and him talking on Fox News, and then Trumpito watching him on Fox, and then watching him on Fox, and then creating Executive Order 13850. And for people who are familiar, 13850 eliminated the use of CRT in any type of federal training around race and diversity. Now, the Biden administration got rid of the executive order, but they're still kind of squeamish on CRT, right? They haven't really backed it and said, because the United States doesn't want to deal with an indictment of itself, right? Because the issue is the United States is a land founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation, period, right? The train has left the station on that, right? And I think a lot of times, and what I've seen in the community of CRT scholars is a mistake. And I'm glad we're broadcasting this and people can ask questions about this later. And I think the mistake is trying to defend CRT for what it is not, and instead of saying, here's what CRT is, right? So when you actually use that particular approach, you disallow any type of conversation that starts to put words in your mouth, right? So a lot of times people are saying, no, it's not, no, it's not. Well, we can redirect that and say, well, here's what it is, and here's what we're not paying attention to. And a lot of the stuff that we're seeing nationally is from people who are clueless about CRT, and that rhetorical war is being won, right? And I think the conversation has to go back to, okay, if you are against CRT, what are you actually for, right? And what do you actually want to be taught? So, school board meetings or what have you, this is the question that people struggle with so much, right? What do you want to be taught? And, it's deadening silence when you ask that question, right? Because the United States is so committed to its own myth making, right? So now, what does it mean to end the making of myth and now not start, but to continue to push for historical accuracy? So I think that moment is challenging us in CRT to still stand for historical accuracy and the larger indictment on the United States according to the United States, right? And I think that's a really important point to make when we start to talk about the current moment in CRT.
The only thing I would add to that, because Dr. Stovall always drops mics, is the fact that as a nation, we have a current Secretary of Education, right, who is a man of color. And we've had this conversation amongst, some of the CRT folks is why has there been no stance, right? And I think for me, that's very telling. The fact that someone who supposedly comes from these communities is still not willing to engage in a conversation about the realities of race and racism in schools, in society, in the ways in which it negatively impacts and harms, right, communities of color. So I think we as a nation need to do a better job. I think of, and I know it's not perfect, right? South Africa has the Truth and Reconciliation Act. We can't even as a nation develop a board to just consider reparations. When those conversations were happening, people were like, oh, no, reparations. They just want to develop a board to explore what reparations might be necessary or what it might look like. And the fact that people were so upset about just the consideration of that, again, is very telling that folks are not willing, as Stovall said, to indict themselves. And I think, again, that's part of our work as CRT scholars is how do we also at times capitulate to status quo, and how do we continually hold ourselves and those around us accountable to make sure that we are continuing to push the conversations that need to happen.
If I can throw in some ideas from a kind of international perspective, what's interesting is that identical arguments that are being made in the US are also being made in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa at the moment. I mean, if we stand back, Fox News tried to have a go at CRT back in 2012. When they attacked Derek Bell, said that he was a racist, that he hated white people. I think the difference between 2012 and 2020 in terms of the traction that the anti-CRT lies have gained is George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. Because I think and it's all perfectly understandable within the concepts of critical race theory. I think you saw Black Lives Matter protests globally. I mean, just so many white-dominated societies had people in the middle of a pandemic that was disproportionately killing people of color. Those societies were brought to a standstill by demonstrations that were not just people of color, that involved a lot of white young people saying, we're not going to stand for this anymore. And I think what you saw was white supremacy recognizing that the danger had just gone up a notch. And so the attacks against critical race theory became supercharged. And, as Stove says right at the beginning, these are not debates about theory. These are not debates about philosophy. This is a political attack meant to just silence any critical perspective on racism and society. So, I think that's how we have to engage with them. That don't imagine that this is a well-intentioned debate about philosophy, because it's not. It's an attempt to tell us to shut up. And as Anne says, one of the interesting things for me, certainly on if you look at how these debates are working in Europe and in Australia, is the prominent position given to conservative people of color to kind of be the flag bearers for this attack. And again, this is understandable in terms of the rules of racial standing. If you can get black people to speak on behalf of whiteness, it's a double whammy, because they say, well, I can't be racist, but I'm telling you that everybody that does CRT is racist. So it makes no logical sense, but it's not about making sense. It's about the kind of politics of the gut and the gutter. And white people want to believe that when you talk about racism, you're being racist, because this is deeply uncomfortable and challenging stuff. And so, you know, there's a lot of people out there very willing to believe that any time that we talk about racism, we're just being racist against white people. And I think, you know, we already have the tools within CRT to absolutely make sense of this, and to try and work against it.
Mm-hmm.
Is this on? Hello. Okay, the next question, thank you for that. How has CRSEA changed or developed from your first time attending?
That's a hard one.
Well, I mean, well, man, look, let's just talk about it real. When I walked into the auditorium, you know, I saw the bold letters and the cursive on the screen. So I was like, damn, like this was, you know, a whole nother, it was like hot time in the city, right? So I'm looking like, oh, damn, like this is a long way from, you know, now 18 years ago when we didn't have a name and we were literally, you know, just working at Renegade because we had a room that we could reserve for free, right? And we had a space, we had a hallway that we could reserve for free. And we were just like, look, come through. I mean, we literally were at the American Educational Research Association conference telling people in sessions, like, look, come through, it's around the corner. Just come through. We got some people presenting. You know, we're gonna be up in the hallway. We got a little bit of a meal. You know, the homie Dave. You know, through race, ethnicity, and education, pay for some sandwiches, and we were just like, yeah, you know, come through. You know, and so to see this is really important for understanding the evolution of things. And I really appreciate the other two founders, Marvin Lynn and Thea Berry, because we did not get founder syndrome. Because a lot of times people will found an organization or found a collection of people and they just try to hold on to it. The piece was always, how do we make space for folks, right? And when we make space for folks, what's included in that space, right? So I think that really becomes important in terms of seeing the evolution of CRSEA, right? And from no name in an auditorium that we got for free to, you know, conferences across the country, literally, right? So this and being able to consistently support graduate students, I think that's a really important through line, right? Because when you do race work, there's always the issue of people trying to discourage you from doing it, right? And in academia, we often forget that we were grad students, and we often get into this thing around, and we need to say it, sadistic punishment. And we forget, and that's a Stockholm syndrome thing, right? So people are punished and feel as if they have to punish the folks who come after them and then say that it was because they love them that they put them through this work, right? And we need to call that for what it is, because it's bullshit, right? And we can't front from that. So anybody is telling you this stuff around, and what we created in this space was to say, anybody who's telling you this stuff, you know, you gotta really understand what this is really telling you to capitulate. And opposed to saying, look, if you do this work, the most important thing is to find other people who do it, so you are never left by yourself. Because when the enemy finds you by yourself, it is the easiest to kill you. Right? And I think this, when you are that explicit, now that becomes a different way of doing, right? It allows you to do things differently. So I always think about, to the question, the evolution of CRSEA, that was our hope and dream, right? So really seeing you all in this space was the manifestation of the hope and dream.
I will add to that. So I'm very fortunate that Dr. Stovall was my advisor. And I think that changed the game because of everything he just said. I also was the research assistant for Dr. Marvin Lynn, and Dr. Berry was a postdoc at in my program at UIC. So I had this cadre of very critical folks. And so when I left UIC, one, I realized like how rare that was. I was like, oh, this isn't normal. Like people just, no, that's not a thing. So that's one piece. I think the mentorship, right? And CRSEA, Dr. Baker and I were just having this conversation, is usually very graduate student heavy. And we actually like that, right? Because our goal is to continue to nurture and grow the future critical scholars, right? And we can't do that if we get the syndrome Dave is talking about, right? That we're too big or we're too good. So I think the humility is huge, right? For all leadership. I also think a difference is, to Dave's point, I remember as Dr. Lynn's graduate student, booking everybody's flights, booking all the rooms. I think it was me. Do you remember Sharon Earthly? Me, Sharon, and like one graduate student did everything for probably a good 3 years. Like it was just us. So I think to see the growth and development, to have committees, to have an executive leadership team, to have the program committee, to have the conference committee, to have the concierge committee, right? The fact that the space that was created also like sowed seeds of what else can we do with this? And I also want to recognize, right, Dr. Malone, who also, right, focused on mentorship. And so I feel like every year, the group of folks who get plugged in and get connected, because they really, as we heard in the earlier session, feel welcome and feel like this is my home, this is my place, that then people feel also a sense of ownership and leadership. And I know for me, that's why I keep coming back, right? Which is kind of wild that it's been these many years. I was like 12 when I started, just so you all know. So it's just wild to see like the growth, but also to see these anchors, right, of care, of community, that to me just continue to hold the organization together the way that it is, and the fact that people kept pushing, right, for us to be here even today.
For me, one of the great things about the organization, which hasn't changed, thankfully, is that these meetings tend to be really engaged, serious, massively supportive, where people by and large don't grandstand. It's not like AERA. People aren't walking around trying to worship the hem of the garment of the person that's got the latest bestseller. They're not trying to get a job. They're just trying to talk and share and learn. And some of the most impactful conversations I've ever had with scholars have been over a orange juice and a sandwich at these meetings, because the predominance of serious people doing serious work is really a blessing at these meetings, because it ain't like that in other education conferences. And long may that continue.
Okay, is this on? Okay. Does anybody have any questions that they want to pose? Halfway.
Oh, no. Oh.
I'll make sure this is a question and not a whole speech that typically takes place. So what, from a practitioner's perspective, what do you say to educators in states or municipalities where folks' conception of critical race theory is literally being outlawed, and folks are losing their jobs or risk losing their jobs, specifically in right to work states, which has its own sort of racialized history?
Yes.
Like, what should they do and what are they to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that's the practice question that we should always be asking, right? And I think it's really around understanding collective power in those spaces that have placed bans on CRT. So being in Illinois, people think about it as a safe haven, but actually there are 5 surrounding states who have either enacted legislation or have that legislation pending on the books. I think it's really important for folks in those right to work states, folks in those spaces where they have been threatened and or fired, to reverse the question around what is the problem with historical accuracy? And how is it that we are so mirrored by engaging in historical accuracy. And when we don't engage in historical accuracy, we just open ourselves up to further absurdity, right? And what is this myth making, right? So now we have to really, it's a pedagogical and it's also a curricular question around really asking, what does this mean? And why would we deny folks historical accuracy, right? To what extent does it prove us right by denying folks this historical perspective that is actually accurate, right? So now I think on the offense is not so much the backtreading, but saying, look, if you're going to engage folks with accuracy, or if you're going to oppose that, then I think this is an important push. And I've seen some folks do this in suburban districts to Chicago. Actually, it was a suburban district that said, well, look, here's what it is. If we're going to go against historical accuracy, then we have to stop using the word critical thinking. Let's just cut it off, right? Because nothing about this is supporting a critical thinker. Myth does not make for a critical thinker. Myth makes for a cog who believes you and then on January 6th goes and robs their own house, right? So that's what January 6th was. It was literally people believing a lie to the point that they felt that the house that is still run by white supremacy was no longer theirs. Right? So now I think those in those states, and what we're seeing is a number of things, and the Great Resignation also plays into this, right? So as people are leaving jobs, and you're starting to see, and what we're going to see in the next couple of years is this huge growth in teacher shortage in a country that already had one. So now the push is, well, if we're putting folks in here to do this particular work, we got to have two things: a way for them to collectivize and protect themselves from the naysayers. But now, and this is the thing that labor has to actually start to engage, we now have to begin to ask the pedagogical and curricular questions, right? It is not just the labor of this, but it's also the processes in which we engage this, right? And I think that really becomes important. I think that's the next set of work, to really begin to ask these curricular and pedagogical questions around historical accuracy, communication, and being in relationship with folks. But I think that's really important in terms of the praxis of this, right? Because it's not just, critical race theory isn't just something to be theoric, right? It's really something to say, what is it that we're doing given what we know?
The praxis piece is what I just kept thinking about. So I would say from a more, I guess, logistical space this is why teachers unions and unions in general are so important is, how do you collectivize and organize? And you do that through a strong union. And I think that's one of the benefits coming out of a city like Chicago. We have a very strong union, and they have done an amazing job of really reframing the conversation. And so when things were happening, right, in terms of like school closings in Chicago, they kept pushing that the kids' learning conditions were their teaching conditions. And so if we're going to improve learning conditions, we have to improve teaching conditions. So I think the teachers, right, need to be in conversation. Leadership needs to be in conversation around how are we going to strategize before some of these bills. And I know for some states it's too late, but to really be proactive in that. The other piece is using standards as your anchor for the work that you're doing. And I think a lot of times people just think about the ideological, which is important, but looking at, so I was in ed policy, right? That's what my doc is in, but right now I'm in a human services program. I know the principles of human services, because when I go into the classroom and I'm focusing on equity and justice and systems and structures of inequality, which is why we need human services, right? Why we need homeless shelters, why we need domestic violence spaces. It's because the system and structure of our society has created these conditions. So when I go look at the principles, and the principles are talking equity and justice, I can talk equity and justice and stand on those principles. And so even if I have students that push back, which I have had students who are like, oh my gosh, we're reading Tara Yoso's Whose Culture Has Capital. It has like a Marx reference in it. Like, oh, wow. Like, it's like, well, let's look at the principles, right? And what I am teaching and what I am pushing in my classroom is actually anchored in these principles that we say as a profession we value. And so I think for us to know, right, what those standards are, those learning standards, what are those principles? Because then when you have people coming to attack, I'm living out what we say as a profession is what we're about, right? So I'm not actually going off script. I'm not over here in this leftist critical space, right? I am doing what we say as a profession, right, we espouse to do. And this is, I can show you how I can align my readings, my assignments to the actual principles and standards. So I think that's one way also to be more on that offense instead of that defense.
The only thing I'd add is I think it's really important that we don't get sucked into the idea that everything was fine before 2020.
Yes.
Because schools have, public schools, education policymakers have never been our friends and colleagues. We've always been unwelcome. Our analysis has always been heretical. It's just that at the moment, all the cards are on the table. So this isn't the first time there have been attempts to intimidate people doing this work. Mm-hmm. They've always been there. We've always had a target on us. So I think, although the current situation is pretty incredible, it's a difference in intensity rather than a kind of fundamental difference. So I think what we have to do is what we've always done, which is strategize. So don't imagine that the public school is the only place where we can do this work. And really don't imagine that the people who are picketing school boards and the like, have they really been the audience that we've been trying to reach? Because I think, the people that we're trying to reach, that we work with every day, are not the folks that are intimidating us, who are putting our names and addresses on the internet. So I just think it's really important to kind of keep in perspective that we're always working as a kind of outlaw kind of set of educators. At the moment, the situation is particularly pronounced. But I think the way to deal with it is as we always have, which is strategizing, working with communities, working with like-minded people, because as both Stove and Anne have said, if you try and do this by yourself, if you try and just fight the battle on the battlefield that's been identified by white supremacy, then you're lost. So as always, it's about being strategic and working out what are the important battles and which are the ones that we can win.
I just want to add, Dave, something you just said, which is the importance of community and of the parents and the students. And I think this is also why it's important that our pedagogy, right, aligns with the needs of community, because parents and teachers will show up. Parents and students will show up. And I think that's also why we need to make sure that our classrooms reflect the conditions that our students and our families are dealing with, right? Because then they will come, right, to strategize with us. And I think that oftentimes, unfortunately, right, especially with these, the last decade or so, having schools not connected to community, closing schools, right, in particular communities, was also a strategy, as Dr. Gillborn said, right, to kind of dismantle some of the work. And so I think it's so important that we really create school spaces that are also welcoming to community, and in particular to communities that are struggling, because then, and it's not for these reasons, right? This should be a part of your pedagogy and your practice. But it's so important because when we start having these kinds of issues, they're going to show up without us even saying anything, right? So I think that's also important for us, right, in our work, that we really are about the community and that we have spaces where our parents and our students understand these historical accuracies and that they're trying to do something about it, so that when they come for us, right, we already have a set of folks who are willing to defend the work that we do and the importance of this work in the classroom for their families, right, for their community.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat. It's on the screen here. I'll read it. Thank you, Cerelia Bazell, for the question. What are the new racist tactics you have seen evolved from 2020 to now? And what do you think are essential tools to identify these mechanisms, particularly within the workplace?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I don't think they're new, right? I think they've intensified in some ways, but they're not necessarily new, right? Because history reminds us of this, right? We're in this kind of quasi-McCarthyist moment, right? So when you think about the Un-American Activities Committees of the 1950s, this was the broader question, right? They would ask you what it was that you were doing, and then what has been your contact with the Communist Party or with any kind of socialist dealings. And then it would go in depth to your engagement, right? So now, with the age of social media, with the age of cancel culture, with the age of now being in a COVID world, now when people are more sedentary, it becomes more magnified when people are posting your address, showing pictures of your kids, showing your house, all of these things that have now just enhanced older tactics, right? So I think it's not thinking about it in terms of being new, but thinking about it as being enhanced, and also these particular mechanisms that we have to pay attention to. Just what Ann said. Once you have committed to justice, it is never about if the enemy is coming. It is always about when. So now the devil is at our front door, right? And you have to take, I love this quote from the Zapatistas, right? It says, "We will greet our enemies with rifles and roses." Right? So this thing around now, how do we begin to think about the rifle and the rose, right? Because the intensification by way of all these new media devices now kicks it up with the hope that it will have us retreat, right? And I think this is the most difficult thing about this moment, right? Because we really are asking people to not fear being in harm's way, right? I want to have that conversation in a real way, right? So because we're not, now we need to think about what are the ways that we begin to recognize it, but again, not as old, not as new, I should say, but as intensified.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, to me, the tactic that I see, and it's not new, is the co-opting of language, right? How many of us right now are at an institution that, like, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, like, you have a new committee for it, you have new hires for it, supposedly, right? So I think that's the piece. It's like, we already know the strategy. We already know what they're going to do. They're trying to, use our language against us. So I think, to Stovall's point, just really being ready, right? These are not new, they're just intensified.
So in
my work, sometimes I get into the shadows
Oh.
of the system. Good. Hey. So in my work, sometimes it's easy to get into the shadows with the system and the institution being so big. But one thing that I have found within the work that I do with curriculum and pedagogy and supporting schools and teachers across districts is not only the co-opting of language, but the weaponization of language like equity, diversity, and inclusion to perpetuate and maintain the status quo and actually create more oppressive structures and systems. So just some of your takeaway as, you know, I'm hearing Dr. Stovall, you know, building a community and coalition, but it does get really difficult understanding the grandeur of it all, of the system, and you're working within a system that is naming equity, diversity, and inclusion, but it's more like working towards white supremacy and more whiteness. So just your thoughts on that. I think I'll just go back to community. One being strategic, I think, especially for grad students, junior faculty in the room, like don't join every committee, because some committees are just that. They're a committee and they're going to take away your time. And maybe you'll develop a report that nobody will read. So now you've spent hours and hours having these conversations that goes nowhere. So I think being strategic, and I know it's easier to say, right, once you have a more stability, right? So I got tenure a couple of years ago. So now like I was doing this because, again, my mentors, but I think you have more confidence, right? But I think to say no to things, right? If you see it, and we kind of know, right? When you see the bullshit, like don't say yes. Sometimes we're forced to be on these committees, but then knowing I'm only going to give this committee X amount of my time, right? I'm not going to put everything in it because I know that this really is superficial and it's fluff. And so again, that's where I think the community piece is so important. And so figuring out, and me and Dr. Baker, I don't know if she's in here, we're just having this conversation. People talk about being scholar activists. You still have to do the scholarship, right? And so you have to be writing, right? You have to find a way to balance it, which is not easy, right? When you're out in the community and stuff is happening, it's much easier in an institution to control these things, right? You cannot control a kid whose brother just got shot, right? You have to contend with that. You have to deal with that. So I think, though, just being really wise about your time, which again is hard to do, I think, as graduate students, as new faculty, because we're excited. We want to do the work. This is also where like finding the faculty that are tenured, that have been around an institution for a long time, go have coffee with them, right? Go have, and I know in COVID, maybe have a Zoom with them, but you know what I mean? But to have a real conversation about like, hey, I was invited to do this thing. What do you think about that? What can you tell me about this committee here on campus? They'll tell you. They might not tell you with, you know, certain people around, but if you have that one-on-one and you develop those relationships, I have found that people will be honest about like, don't waste your time on that.
If I can throw one idea in there from someone who has spent way too long on way too many bullshit committees, one way of trying to stay sane on them is to actually use the system against itself. So if the committee is, you know, if there's a committee on diversity and inclusion, get on it and let them make all these grand claims about how the university is going to push forward on A, B, and C, and then throw in the idea that, well, how do we demonstrate we're going to do this? Which data are we going to draw on? Because actually, at the moment, we either don't have the data, or the data says that we're not inclusive and we're not anti-racist. And actually, you can, you know, I'm a big believer in. Don't try and change hearts and minds. Just make it more difficult for institutions to be racist, okay? Because if you make the institution a bit less racist, some hearts and minds will come along. But if the white folks don't like it, that's difficult. But that's not the most important thing. So if we can get a more diverse student body, if we can get a more diverse staff body, those things become kind of virtuous circles. They help you to take things apart. It's incredibly slow, but it can be done. And again, it's that idea of strategizing, of not seeing everything as being about one battle, but of thinking, well, you know, if these people are trying to use our language, that ought to be something that we can turn to our advantage. So, you know, because we're smarter than they are. So how do we do that? Because they will create traps for themselves if we think about how we can lead them by the hand towards that trap.
Right.
Is this on? Okay, we're a bit over time, and I just wanted to see if you had any last remarks, quick couple seconds, and then we can move on to the schedule. I just want to, you know, make sure everything flows right. So
Definitely. And for the sake of time, just something quick. If you have a card that you are distributing to people and your title is longer than a paragraph, you do absolutely nothing. That's it.
I don't even know what to say after that. I would just say find your community, right? Whether it's here, in other spaces, like that is what is going to keep you sane and what's going to keep you doing this work.
Yeah, I won't take up any more of your time.
all right, let's thank the presenters. And again, this is a really grassroots organization, so you know you can definitely talk to these scholars, you know, during the conference. So if you have any questions, please bring them up.
We have about a 10-minute break before we start our concurrent sessions for the grad student and junior faculty sessions. Please let us know if you have any questions, room locations. All of them are hybrid as well, so you could join from the comfort of your computer if you have them. But we do have rooms in